Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to the Philly chapter for having me on today. I'm excited to, I guess, give you the usual spiel on the history of the K4, touch a little bit about the history of the shops here, the test department, how it was created, and a little bit of the history of the K4 and its service time, and then some restoration updates. And at the end, I will be happy to do a Q&A with anyone who wants to throw me some questions. And we'll get started here and then do a little introduction about who I am and who we are. So I have a little clip here just giving a little bit of a, why we're doing what we're doing. So hopefully this comes through on your end. This is not a museum of artifacts alone. It is the story that they tell. It's about the people who built this town, who built this country. This locomotive is the embodiment of their testament of hard work, labor, dedication, and loyalty. Altoona Railroad City is something that we celebrate here at the museum.
From the perspective of the Railroaders Memorial Museum and railroad history in general, the K4 embodies the people of Altoona, right? It was designed here in Altoona, it was built in Altoona, and with us working with the museum, we're going to rebuild it here in Altoona for really to serve as a centerpiece of railroad history in the community.
The restoration of K4-1361 is such a worthwhile endeavor because there are only two like it that can be found in the entirety of the world. Both this one and another one have been deemed the official steam locomotives of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
There were 425 K4s built. 350 of them were built here, 75 of them were built by Baldwin in Philadelphia. So if this were a Baldwin locomotive, one of those Baldwin K4s, it wouldn't have nearly the local tie that this one does.
So if you think about the significance of this locomotive, it's because its roots are in Altoona, but really beyond Altoona, it's also the American story of industrial USA. The K4 is really one of the first scientifically developed steam locomotives in the country. Built in 1918, it represents the very best of the Pennsylvania Railroad's technology and innovation.
What we have available to us today with the CAD software and the finite element analysis, it's really helping us to fine-tune some of the things that the Pennsylvania Railroad was doing. And so whatever work we do to this boiler and to the locomotive itself will be done to the Pennsylvania Railroad standard.
I would say that this restoration has an upper edge over previous efforts, just merely due to the fact that technology has evolved so greatly over the past 35 years. I think it really empowers a lot of the engineers and the volunteers that will be taking on this task as a labor of love.
We've been very impressed with the work of the volunteers here at the museum. It'll be a good teamwork between us and them in the museum to get the project done.
The long-term strategy, once the thing is complete, is to be able to take it around the region in order to expose the museum's mission to a broader audience.
It'll be a rolling ambassador going around the Commonwealth to different tourist railroads and heritage railroads in the region. I also think it'll be a real benefit to the museum, helping to support the bottom line. I think the timeline with any steam locomotive project is dependent on a couple of factors. First factor is the rate of fundraising and the funds available, and the second factor is really what you find when you dig into a project. But what's really nice is all the pieces are here, the locomotive's disassembled, so now it's really a matter of fixing the boiler, inspecting the rest of the pieces, and putting it back together.
Come to the museum and become a member, right? Get interested in the project. You'll be hearing more and more about the project itself and ways you can support it as time goes by, but everyone who comes to this museum and everyone who becomes a member is supporting the K4 project.
This locomotive clocked over 2.5 million miles over a 40-year career. That's 5 round trips to the moon. That is how far this locomotive traveled. And it probably carried as many people as miles that it clocked. Think about all of the families that went on vacations, all the business people who went out and traveled on it. Think about all the stories that were experienced on the trains being pulled by K4 1361. And if that doesn't speak to why it's worthy of preservation, then I don't know what is.
So the K4 means a lot to all of us in different ways. Here's a picture of it freshly shopped or refurbished in preparation of it going to Horseshoe Curve to be put on display in 1957. It was a great PR tool the railroad utilized at that point. And you think of all the tens of thousands of locomotives that were built in Altoona, this was the only one to reside in Altoona and remain local. And it really makes it much special, really special for us in today's sense, where it means so much for the local community as it does for the rail fan and rail preservationist community at large. For those who didn't catch that, I am Joe DeFrancesco. I'm the museum's executive director. That's a picture of a much younger me in 2007 when I attended a Railway Historical Society rail camp at Scranton. That was the first time I got to see the K4 in person, dating myself here a little bit. But it really was what drew me to this museum as a volunteer, as a teenager, and wanting to get involved. And similarly, other folks got involved in the 80s as volunteers because they were interested in seeing it return to operation. Many folks who went to the Horseshoe Curve as a visitor from 1957 till 1985 also had connections with the locomotive as it was that embodiment of a time era that made Altoona great and really symbolizes when railroading was king. So moving forward, it drew in other people too. There's a photo of our chairman and myself, Wick Moorman. Those of you who know of Wick, you know him as the retired chairman, CEO of Norfolk Southern, also chairman of Amtrak for a short stint after he was pulled out of retirement. And one person who, honorable mention in every sense, is Bennett Levin. Many of you, I'm sure, know who he is. Bennett and Wick got together before the pandemic in 2019 and really wanted to get involved with the K4 and knew that it was here and it needed help. And looking at the bigger picture, many steam locomotives are either isolated, they're their own project, but this one's very unique in the sense that it's linked to a museum. So you just can't focus on a locomotive without looking at the larger picture. And both Wick and Bennett knew that there were other aspects to getting involved and getting the K4 restarted. One of them was reorganizing and restructuring the museum itself. And some way, shape, or form, or divine intervention, I came back into the fold and got to know both gentlemen very well. And we started talking about what is it going to take to correct course. So Wick and Bennett joined the board in 2019, and we worked together to restructure the board. And we have a very dynamic board now that's very capable. Joining them in 2020 was Don Grob, who's the retired vice president of mechanical Norfolk Southern, Mark Ritchie, the president of Curry Rail in Hollidaysburg, Frank Givler, who's the local chapter president for the Horseshoe Curve chapter of the NRHS. You have Jason Lamb, who until recently was the general manager of the Everett Railroad, and Wick and Bennett. And it's just been a really, really good transformation here at the museum. Wick and Bennett brought in FMW Solutions to spearhead the project. This picture shows two gentlemen from FMW. The gentleman beside me is Shane Matter, who is the vice president mechanical, Shane brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to this project as really the mechanical guy here. His background is with the 21st Century STEAM program that Norfolk Southern had. He was largely responsible for reconditioning the Southern 4501 at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum and getting it operational. The next gentleman there to the far right is Davidson Ward. He is the president of FMW Solutions and founder. Davidson brought together talent, including Shane and others such as Wolf Fengler, who is our chief engineer on the project, who've been working together to correct the project and from a mechanical standpoint and take it one step at a time. But it's a great team of individuals from across the spectrum. And of course, our volunteers. Our volunteers are very, very dedicated. Some of them are from Norfolk Southern, from the shops, and they bring the mechanical skill set that's needed. We have others who are in the steam preservation realm with steam traction engines. And then we have some local folks who are just here and happy to learn and just eager to see the project move forward in any way, shape they can contribute. So this is a little graphic we came up with for the K4 as America's scientific locomotive. And what I mean by that, well, I'm happy to explain as we talk about the K4's development. That slogan, if you're familiar with the late William Withune, who was a curator for the Smithsonian, he was involved in the 80s with the K4 and had worked on publishing a book, and it was published, unfortunately, after his death, but he really did a nice write-up in his book about American steam locomotives. And the section on the K4 and its development was really rooted in the idea that the K4 was one of the first, if not the first, American scientifically developed steam locomotive. So where does the story begin? You know, it's the early 1900s. It begins right here in Altoona. This is one of the earliest shots of the shops being constructed. Now, coincidentally, of note, where the museum is located in downtown Altoona is approximately in the same area that this photograph is taken. The site is home to the original shops that were constructed in the 1850s. And as we progress, why Altoona? Well, the Horseshoe Curve. The Pennsylvania Railroad, chartered in 1846, needed a base of operation as it was working westward to overcome the Allegheny front of the mountains. Primitive early steam locomotives that were largely built and constructed by Baldwin were very much taxed when going over the Allegheny Mountains. So routine maintenance, travel was much slower. So if you've heard of the Logan House, a lot of trains would come east from Philly to Altoona, and a lot of passengers would get off at the Logan House board as the train was getting ready to go over the mountain westward on to Pittsburgh. As you can see, through the decades since the 1850s, the shops are growing in downtown Altoona. I believe this is of the 12th Street area. And in fact, this photo very well could have been taken from the Logan House looking towards the 12th Street shops. If you look to the left, I believe that is the 12th Street pedestrian bridge for context. This is from the 17th Street perspective, looking back at the original shop complex. And this just shows the growth over the decades since being established in Altoona. The train shed and the Logan House are off to the left of the photograph. And as the area of the shops at 12th Street were growing, they really were at capacity. So they expanded east to Juniata, and this is the Juniata shops under construction. And as you can see, Horseshoe Curve is also expanding. It went from one track to 2 tracks, and eventually on to 4. When the 4th track was added, this was when the Broadway was conceived with the expansion, and a lot of that was to the attributes of A.J. Cassatt, who we will talk about on this next slide. So you have the standardization of the Pennsylvania Railroad really taking shape in this time frame of Cassatt's tenure. The leadership of Alexander Johnson Cassatt established the Pennsylvania Railroad's global reputation as a leader in railroad technology. Born to an upper-class Pittsburgh family in 1839, Cassatt traveled to Germany to study engineering at Darmstadt University. At the age of 20, he graduated from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute with a degree in civil engineering. Cassatt joined the PRR in 1861, became a general superintendent in 1870, and had risen to first vice president by 1880. Bringing his knowledge of German engineering practice to the PRR, he assisted in the development of standardized locomotives, a practice never before utilized by American railroads. So as a part of his studying in Europe, Cassatt's application of German practice and applied research led the Pennsylvania Railroad to become a leader in every aspect of railroad engineering. The laboratories at Altoona were constantly at work testing the performance of every aspect of railroad operations, from wood preservation techniques to tensile strength of steel and material durability. The published results of the test department established the company's place as a leader in science. By 1900, inspired by similar efforts at Purdue and Columbia universities, PRR leadership realized a locomotive test plant would provide invaluable insight into locomotive efficiency. Such information would allow the company to continue to lead the world in locomotive design. Under Cassatt's vision, the plant was designed and installed at Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904 in St. Louis, Missouri. When the exhibit closed at the exposition, the test plant was disassembled and transported in pieces to Altoona. Under the supervision of Chief of Motive Power Theodore Ely, engineers Axel Vogt and his assistant William Kiesel Jr. oversaw the installation and removal of the test plant in St. Louis and reinstallation in Altoona. By the end of 1906, new buildings had been constructed, and the test department, recently expanded under Cassatt, was ready to begin testing. On December 28, 1906, a Class E2A passenger locomotive was the first to be put through the paces on the treadmill. Alexander Cassatt never got to witness his achievements. He passed away that same day at his Rittenhouse Square townhouse in Philadelphia. Yep. As you can see, this is from 1905. It shows the shop complex here at the 12th Street facilities. Off to the upper left are tagged or hash marked building outlines. Those are the test department facilities, including the treadmill and the testing department to be constructed later. Of note, the Master Mechanic's office building, of which the museum is located in today, housed the original testing laboratories where they would test some of the smaller items, the metallurgy, the chemicals, etc. That was done here in this building. So it's really neat to see that the birth of the test department really was in this facility and outgrew from the 1880s. It outgrew its current or then footprint, and the priority was then shifted to a much more expansive testing facility. Here is we have a photographic collection of the test department being constructed around 1910, 1913 in the 17th Street vicinity. If you look to the far right of the photograph, you can see Alto Tower in its earliest configuration. I guess, here we go. Hold on, sorry about that. My mouse is being cantankerous here. It's fighting me. My apologies. Okay, so the expansion of the shops over the years, this is a 1940s or 50s aerial photograph of this area. To the upper left, you will see where the museum Master Mechanics building is located, and then to the lower, the upper right, to the lower left is the test department, with a lot of those shops in that vacant area being torn down for more room for storage as the facilities grew to Juniata. So the test department facilities were constructed adjacent to the engineering and research departments near residential and commercial districts. Residents remember the thundering noise of locomotives on the treadmill that could be heard outside in their homes and on the occasional Sunday in nearby churches. Altoona was indeed a railroad city. The noise and smoke were part of routine life every day. Testing results inspire innovation. Thanks to the expansion of the test department, the Pennsylvania Railroad possessed one of the largest private research and development laboratories in the country. From December of 1906 through the beginning of K4 development in 1913, the Altoona Test Plant had operated 33 locomotives and performed 52 batteries of tests. So during this time, they were collecting that data and analyzing the performance of those locomotives. This is an earlier class Pacific. I believe it is a K3 or a K2 on the treadmill. And as you know, the K4 was not the first Pacific for the railroad to have. They had K2s, K3s, K28s, and K29s that were built by other builders that they brought to research. But it's just really interesting because the earlier K locomotives were really the apex of the 19th century technology, an expanded version of the E6 and E class. As you can see, there is a E-class locomotive on the treadmill. You can tell it was freshly constructed as the interior was very clean and bright. So the treadmill on exhibit. So going back to the exposition in Missouri, the treadmill was there, and that was the primary infrastructure that was packed up and shipped to Altoona. It's comprised of a giant locomotive treadmill coupled to a diameter and other test equipment. The locomotive test plant could measure every aspect of locomotive performance. Under the supervision of E.D. Nelson, engineer of tests, 8 different locomotives from 5 different railroads, including one of German and French design, were tested before a public audience in between June and December of 1904 at the exposition. The locomotive test plant would become one of the most popular attractions at the exposition. So, as a part of the Broadway, Horseshoe Curve was expanded, as well as most of the lines and infrastructure throughout the entire system. You have the creation of Penn Station in New York, the tunnels, the electrification of those lines in and out under the vision of A.J. Cassatt and Samuel Ray, who was vice president at that time, who led a lot of those expansion efforts. The Horseshoe Curve is seen here in the early 1900s with 4-track main line, and the coinage of the Broadway the concept of the Broadway was created. Through the years since, motive power was needed that would accommodate the longer trains and also meet the speed of the routes to make, for faster trains and capacity. So as these tests were being conducted and the different forms of motive power being analyzed, the K4 was developed to handle all of those various needs. Cassatt is president of the PRR from 1889 to 1906. Cassatt's development brought the company to the leading edge of civil engineering. The 4-track Broadway from New York to Washington, D.C., the Hudson River tunnels, the Rockville Bridge, all stand today over a century later, a testament to his vision. In Altoona, the creation of the test department would also bring the Pennsylvania Railroad's excellence to mechanical engineering to worldwide prominence. The PRR's research and test department locomotive testing plant in Altoona combined the very best of scientific research from around the world. The K4 can be credited as the first locomotive to be designed from the ground up from testing results here in Altoona. Testing, a new standard. Locomotive testing focused on the following: steam evaporation, combustion, compound expansion, effective throttle control on boiler and mechanical efficiency, firebox grate design, briquetted coal, grease versus oil lubrication, firebox configuration, exhaust nozzles, and drafting efficiency, cinder filtering and smoke box, burning and ash characteristics of different coals, firing techniques, steam action and cylinders and valves, types of superheaters, types of mechanical stokers, alternate types of valve gears, types and sizes of piston valves, smoke abatement, and specific performances of both existing and prototype locomotives. So, for whatever reason, my mouse wants to go a different way than I'm presenting. So my apologies. The trial class, which is what I credit to the E6. We're all very familiar with the excellent restoration the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania did with the Lemberg engine, the 460. It is a great example of that predecessor class and what was used as a prototype for the K4. The E6 Atlantic, some of the analytics there that was, captured at the test department. So engineers and, scientists would look at this and say, okay, well, if we, as I mentioned, the extensive list of different aspects they were looking at while they were being, on the test bed, they would say, okay, well, if we change this one aspect, what would be the output over here? So the E6 provided a lot of good analytical data that as they were comparing it to other classes, it would set the standard for the development of the K4 class. And something I haven't mentioned yet, but is also its sister freight counterpart, the L1. So the L1 and the K4 were developed in very much the same aspect and manner. Here are some graphics of the test department building that was adjacent to the treadmill. Different layouts, different laboratories, under construction. So General Superintendent of Motive Power, J.T. Wallace, and Head of Locomotive Engineering in Altoona, along with Voigt, Gibbs, and Kiesel, all were a part of the K4 design team, which utilized test results from predecessor locomotives and developed the K4 design based on proven results. The K4 utilized a new boiler design while sharing the standardized design from the E6 class, simply adapted for the K4 class, thus creating a locomotive that met operational needs of the PRR. In early spring of 1914, Wallace's team of engineers created the first of 425 K4s to come. 1737 would become the first standard passenger locomotive. This is a photo of earlier locomotives being constructed in Altoona and how they were, if you look at the shop layout, you have a lot of different things going on in these earlier shops. As the shops were at capacity many times prior to the larger expansion programs, you'd see, frame, you would not see the typical, perception of an assembly line in the larger production era of the Pensy. So that was something that, looking at efficiency and management of human resources that played a factor in later shop expansion at the time around the K4 and the other classes were being constructed. Such can be said in the boiler shop, where boilers, you had boiler shops, you had flue shops, you had a whole breakdown of different things going on that went on before going on to the final assembly in the erecting shops. As a direct result of the PRR's first attempt to standardize its design and construction methods of the K4, it developed the L1 class. So sharing the boiler and many of the other design aspects and going into the overall construction and equipment that was used, such as the trailing trucks, the construction methods, they were all very much a compatible, interchangeable design minus the running gear. The L1 boiler and the K4 shared the same, as I mentioned, while the wheels and drive system was designed for freight service. So think of the running gear as you know, a gear system in your transmission in your vehicle. Cars have a certain type, and semis have another for different, you know, one for freight, one for passenger. The first L1 was tested in July of 1914, and the need for PR was greater for a freight locomotive, and this was largely, you know, a credit to World War One. So the freight locomotive took priority and was in production by 1914. After the first K4 1737 was released in 1914, there was actually a gap in production until 1918, when you saw the railroad shift its priority to the passenger side of operations. This is a photo of 1737, freshly out of the shop and under steam. The K4 was not the first developed locomotive as a result of the test plant, but it was a refinement of earlier designs such as the E6, K2, K3, K28, and K29 locomotives. Of the predecessors of the K4, only the E6 design proved to be a success and could be significantly improved with minor alterations, whereas principal design was a limiting factor for other K-class locomotives. And these are the K4 specs. If you would compare these to the E6s, you could just see it was very much an enlarged E6 locomotive. As the shops expanded east into Juniata, you can see the physical plant taking shape. In the 1920s, the erecting shop, the now iconic Juniata locomotive shop for Norfolk Southern, is there. In fact, I believe it's newly constructed in this photograph. And the really neat thing is, if you look closely, you can see K4s there in the lineup next to the building. So they must have been freshly built and released. Also of note, you can see freight cars in the foreground getting trucks swapped out and some repairs being done in the yard area. Blacksmith shop, where a lot of the drive rods were forged. In the boiler shop, they were, you know, rolling sheets such as the firebox here. So keep in mind, a lot of these photographs document the construction methods of steam locomotives, and as it relates to the restoration of K4 1361, it would be nice to have a lot of this tooling, but it's just not there anymore. So the way we're reconstructing the firebox is done based on the way we can do it in modern sense without those big rollers and heavy equipment that's no longer in existence. Such as boiler construction, they would construct a boiler of this nature for riveting in an upright position. Frame construction, a lot different than the photograph that I showed earlier depicting the shop with, you know, kind of helter-skelter with all the different all the different parts there. They were able to utilize the newly expanded shops in a much more efficient manner. Here's 1737 with the crew down at the shops. And here's a photograph of a K4 in the test plant with some of the testing apparatuses hooked up. A much later photograph, probably in the late 1920s or early 30s. And keep in mind, once the K4s were produced, they were still continuously being tested for upgrades and improvements. The K4 would go on to serve until the end of steam with a roster of 425, slowly becoming smaller. They were taken out of service, no longer needed, too costly to repair, or were wrecked. Over the lifespan of the majority of the class, the boiler and overall design would go unchanged, only to receive mechanical appliance upgrades, new fixtures, and cosmetic changes, including a new pilot. K4s would also be seen utilize a number of PR design, or K4s could also be seen utilizing a number of PR design tenders from early designs to long haul. Only a few would be streamlined, semi-streamlined, and experimental applications for testing. So on to 1361. Here's one of the earliest known photographs of 1361 outside of Washington, D.C. Notice the extended piston rods, the front pilot, the old style headlamp. But of note, it was an oil lamp that was converted to electricity. You can see the steam generator in front of the smokestack. There was no stoker on the locomotive at this time, no power reversing. And those were improvements that were done later to the locomotive. And labor laws would also play a big factor in those improvements. Samples of the K4. If you're familiar with the book, Many Faces of the K4, it's a great resource to show the evolution of those improvements to the class. At the Juniel locomotive shops. Streamlining. I believe that's right in your guys' backyard. It's due interlocking. The K4 has style. In 1937, Raymond Loewy established a relationship with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and his most notable designs for the firm included some of mostly their passenger locomotives. He designed a streamlined shroud for the K4 and redesigned a 1938 Broadway Limited. He followed the styling of he influenced and designed the experimental S1 locomotive, as well as the T1 class, are two examples of the streamlined K4. Later, the Pennsylvania Railroad's request, he restyled Baldwin's diesels with a distinctive shark nose reminiscent of the T1. While he did not design the famous GG1 electric locomotive, he improved its appearance with welded rather than riveted construction, and he added the pinstripe paint scheme to highlight its smooth contours. In addition to locomotive design, Loewy Studios provided many designs for the Pennsylvania Railroad, including stations, passenger car interiors, and advertising materials. By 1949, Loewy employed 143 designers, architects, and draftsmen. Some, K4s were experimental, such as the elephant ears, the Milwaukee-style smoke lifters, which were fitted to the top. And there are some videos out there of K4s with being tested with different experimental appliances, such as the elephant ears and the smoke lifters or deflectors. The semi-streamlined K4. This is personally one of my favorite alterations or configurations, if you will, with the drop coupler pilot, while maintaining its pre-war front end smoke box cover. Here's 1361 down east at, I believe, South Amboy with sister locomotives. Front end throttle applications. While some locomotives did maintain the pre-war slatted pilot look. The long haul tender version. And to my knowledge, one of it would be the third earliest picture of 1361. In this picture, it's really neat to zoom in and look at all the details, but under the keystone, it has the name train plate for the Spirit of St. Louis. And here it is photographed in East St. Louis in 1939. In Ohio in 1947, this is the last known photograph of the K4 before it was modernized later that year. In service on New York and Long Branch. And I believe a lot of these are Don Wood photographs. A K4 leaving the Altoona station. So the Pennsylvania Railroad Technical and Historical Society actually published its record cards in one of the keystones. And I'm going to skim over this, but it is available online with all the different improvements that were done. As mentioned, it received different tenders. It had superheater, air pumps improvements. Stoker was added. Brakes were improved, and the whole 9 yards. It got a and my apologies, my mouse went crazy again. I will be getting a different mouse. By the end of the 1950s, as you can imagine, they were graveyarded, they were white lined and scrapped. 1361 was saved by pure luck. Whenever the city of Altoona wanted to, or whenever the Pennsylvania Railroad decided to preserve a locomotive to place on display at Horseshoe Curve, they decided they wanted to preserve a K4, and they just went down to the yards and pulled whichever one they could easily get to, and 1361 was the lucky winner of that draw. And it was taken into the shop, cosmetically restored, and put on display in 1957 at the Horseshoe Curve, and became an icon. And here are photographs of it being put on display at Horseshoe Curve. The PRR actually had a special train where officials and residents were taken on an excursion to the curve for its dedication. This is around 1985, right after the K4 was taken off the curve and brought down to the museum. And as you can see between the different pictures, age was not kind to it. And really, a couple visionaries at that time, local state representative Richard A. Geist, Conrail president Stanley Crane, and the museum all partnered together to fundraise and to convince the railroad to allow the K4 to be restored. In 1987, it was unveiled at the Altoona car shops where the work was done and ranched briefly in excursion service, and really reinvigorated a new generation of K4 enthusiasts. And it was a brief return to service, but it was what was needed to seed the interest to today's efforts. So, as you know, it's very common knowledge that the K4 had a checkered history in the 1990s, early 2000s. If you want to get into that, it's all online. But the consolidation of the effort took place around 2010 to 2015, with all the parts coming back to Altoona, being stored in the old museum facility that we have here on site, while the new roundhouse was under construction. Some of the running gear was worked on with volunteers in the old facility. And these are just a series of photographs showing the boiler and all the other components and storage. Excuse me. One of the first projects done by the volunteers in the newly constructed roundhouse was the refurbishment and reconstruction of the ash pan. The boiler brought in and stored on a flat car with the tender. Various parts at that time were organized, sorted, and the volunteers got to work on establishing a very basic shop that they could work in. Parts organization and storage continued. And one of the first milestones with my involvement here at the museum was we fundraised with the Emory Trust and the local PRRTHS chapter to raise funds to sandblast the tender and get it in the primer. And you can see the process underway there. This is about 2019. Volunteer applying what I like to call works gray, which is not too far-fetched from what Baldwin used in terms of priming their equipment. And I mentioned Baldwin because our tender is actually a Baldwin-built tender, I think it's a 130 class, which is unique because the K4 that's at the State Museum has a 110 class tender. So this is, in terms of a more desirable tender to have for our locomotive, this one is ideal because it has a larger capacity. and the tender was built in 1925 by Baldwin. So one of the challenges early on when FMW was hired was the boiler was on a flat car, and in order to work on the boiler, it needed to be off that flat car. So one of the challenges was, how do we get it off of the flat car in the facility? So a suspension system was rigged up with I-beams and pneumatic jacks, and we were able to lift the boiler just an inch or two off the flat car, all the clearance that was needed, and the flat car was rolled out. Then the second challenge became getting the frame out of the old building. And as you can see in this photograph, the frame was put in by cranes, and that was before the roundhouse was built. So it was a lot easier for crane rigging to get to that area of the old building to put it in there. But since the roundhouse was built, it limited that access. So we were able to construct a ramp and lower the tender very, very slowly from the old building onto the turntable. And this was done around early 2021. Our volunteer here, Mike Reindl, was cleaning up the cylinder area and getting the parts and the roundhouse prepared for our 2021 announcement of relaunching the project. To a lot of gratitude of the Pennsylvania Railroad Technical and Historical Society for the fundraiser for the firebox. We were able to receive funding from other donors as well that got us to the point to replacing the firebox, as I'll talk briefly here in a moment or two on why we had to replace and why it was deemed a good approach to replace the firebox. So in this photograph, you can see the side sheets here, the outer wrapper, the firebox at Steamtown. During that time, some patching was done, and the FRA standards changed with the safety factor of 4. And having FMW come in as part of their first task was doing a engineering study of the existing conditions. And it was deemed that the firebox did not meet those standards that it needed to meet. And a combination of restoration work before and PRR era repairs, the firebox was just it would be too labor intensive to repair that existing structure. So, as well as other issues with thicknesses on the firebox. So it was deemed that a new firebox would be needed to replace the old. And that was the process here of dismantling the existing firebox in preparation to receive the new sheets. And here is Shane Metter of FMW cutting the supports of the inner and the outer sheets in the disassembly process. This is a really good picture because, as I mentioned, the patchwork, you can see the weld seams and there's about 3 or 4 different series of repairs of that sheet. And it's very, very important to have your spacing, your hole alignments, everything in square per design. And we were having issues with that alignment. And that was one of the factors of needing to replace the firebox and getting all of that corrected. And there's the convertible style of the boilers, is what I like to call it, but in its fully disassembled state. Another process in this previously is everything was scanned. So the UTI scan, non-destructive testing was done to determine the grid, if you will. When you're doing a boiler project, you have to have a grid of 8 inches to analyze the thickness areas of the boiler. The boiler barrel itself actually came back very, very good. There was steam dome repair done previously, and that was a question that our good friends at the FRA wanted us to look at and make sure that was done. And we were able to correct the steam dome patch that was done in the 90s or early 2000s, bringing the boiler into a much better state. Oh, wow, that really went crazy there. So this is an example of the first new sheets or material going back on for fitting. This is a transition piece from the upper roof to the sides that'll be utilized. So these are the first two new pieces to be fitted. And if you go back to the pictures of the fireboxes being rolled, the material being rolled and formed down at the shops, to overcome the challenges of not having access to that equipment, the reconstruction is being done in sections, being fitted up. That is a new outer sheet that has been fitted. And this is the inner sheets being fitted. This is I believe the crown sheet. So going back to how they would roll that in one piece, this is done in sections. And this is where we are today. So there's a lot I'm leaving out in terms of detail because I want all of you fine folks to come here for the annual convention in May. We will have FMW representatives as well as our volunteers here on site walking you through the shop area, explaining the process of reconstructing the firebox and providing a much more in-depth analytical or technical overview of the process. But I can tell you it's a lot of fitting, mocking up, heat treating, putting back on, and that's where we are now. So hopefully by May there will be some a lot more progress to show, and we're just looking forward to welcoming all of you here and showcasing what we've been able to do since 2021. And this leads me to the next slide. Pete Laro did this rendering for us, and this is what our vision is creating a immersive environment here at the museum when the K4 is not out traveling in operation, is creating just a really good sampling of what was the very best of the PRR, as well as the other railroads, successor railroads to the Pensy. Bennett Levin has a tremendous vision, and it's become a part of our strategic plan for the K4, is to have head-end equipment converted into exhibit cars so that the K4 is not just an operating steam engine. It will become a immersive educational tool going around the various short lines, as it will have plenty of opportunity to do. We're very hopeful of that. Promoting and showcasing what made Pennsylvania great, and that was its railroading and its industries. So that'll be a really unique thing for us to do, as well as at that point assembling a fleet of period appropriate coaches to go with the car, or with the locomotive. To the lower right hand corner of the painting is the Union League Club, which is a heavyweight Pullman car that was a Solarium car. It's currently in its maintenance away state, which is virtually Section 8. It's not a very nice car right now, but it's got a lot of potential, and we're hoping once the K4 is done to be able to restore that car and turn it into one of our first class cars. We also have the Mountain View, which is from the Broadway Limited, and it's a much we'll be able to achieve that project or that car very quickly after the K4 is complete. It came to us in a very good solid state. It's in the process of getting windows replaced in it now, and we're hoping that some with a few resources we can get that car quickly put back into operation to go with the K4, or at least be in short line service. In the painting, it shows some other visiting motive power. Maybe we can get some E8s up here for display purposes. The blue engine is the recently acquired SD60i Conrail locomotive that was inherited by Norfolk Southern and then given to Penn State for its rail transportation engineering program. Penn State has since moved the locomotive here, where it will be used as an educational tool for them, and it currently wears a Penn State paint scheme. So why are we doing what we're doing? Well, those are my twin boys. I'm a little biased in this, but I have to throw them out there because they love trains, and really they're the future. And it's not just me, but you think of your kids and grandkids. We want to leave something for them, to pass the torch on to. And the PRR is becoming a distant memory for many folks, unfortunately, as time goes on. So institution like ours and programs like we have, we want to keep the memory alive. And just like my ancestors and so many of ours who worked for the Pensy, they did amazing things in the time that they were given. Whether it was the 1920s when they were building steam locomotives and really the apex and the glory days of steam in Altoona and industry, or it was in 1850 when they had hand tools and black powder building the horseshoe curve. It's really awesome to think that we've been given a chance to keep a part of this legacy alive. So that's what we're all about, is keeping the legacy of the railroaders alive and keeping it for the next generation. So to that end, I will be happy to answer any questions or take any comments or anything from the audience. Of note, we do have our website up to date, so please check that out if you're interested in giving and support. We have a long way to go on the fundraising front, but I'm happy to report that we have the human resources we needed to get the job done. All right, Russ, it's all you. All back to you.
Thank you, Joe. Any questions from our audience here? Okay, I'm going to pass the mic around. I think this one's a little better. For some reason. Let's go ahead and hear it.
My question is in regard to the Altoona being known as the Railroad City. And is it still being known as the Railroad City with the people that work there? Obviously, it's not the same amount of people that work there as used to be working there. And I was also concerned about your Penn State transportation program being training people apparently to work there in the shops of Altoona, and how that is proceeding, and if it's going to be working out well, and it's getting a lot of people that are being employed there as a result of the transportation program at Penn State in Altoona.
Sure. The railroad industry has changed dramatically since the PRR days. It's like anything else with industry, it transforms. The economy changes, workforce changes, so they have to adapt. And unfortunately for Altoona, that's a big cut. At one time, it had 17,000 shop workers, a workforce that was needed to, during the height of production for steam engines. With the diesel era, and again, I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but you had workforce reductions. And with that, also infrastructure, you don't need as many buildings and facilities. In a modern sense, the shops have remained vital to Norfolk Southern for the mechanical services they provide, even in a reduced state compared to the Pensy. From a heritage perspective and a modern day perspective, it's really apples and oranges. But the capabilities of the Altoona shops are very high priority for Norfolk Southern. In terms of the rail transportation program, we're happy to partner in any way, shape, and form with the university, whether providing space or just an educational space for them. But the feedback that I get from the instructors, keep in mind it's a Penn State program, it's not a USAM program, but a majority of their students are guaranteed jobs right out of upon graduation. and they get really good internship programs with the class ones, as well as some other short line regional railroads, even in the with Amtrak and regional transit systems like SEPTA and New Jersey Transit. They have a really good, there's a lot of opportunity for them in the field. And you think of a lot of other industries, right? Retirement and turnaround. There's going to be a void in the industry, and that is a goal of the program, is to help fill that void with capable, well-trained individuals. Okay, any other questions?
Hey, Joe, in the assembly of all of the materials that you had and the parts that you had, was there any components that you were missing altogether?
So in terms of missing parts, surprisingly, I want to say 99% there. And I say surprising because, as you know, the project moved from location to location, whether it's Steamtown or from the shops here at Altoona to Steamtown or back to Altoona. The guys involved did a very good job of keeping everything organized and labeled. And there are some parts that are just worn out that we're going to replace, but we're very thankful that we have access to drawings. FMW has the ability to outsource to foundries if anything needs to be recasted. We have a local foundry here in Hollidaysburg, McClanahan, that we've had discussions with and making some mounting brackets. So we're very, very fortunate in that regard that, I can't say 100% because I'm not an encyclopedia, but for what we have, we're very confident we have a majority of it. Well over 95% of the parts, 98% of those parts here, and what is not here, we can get it reproduced.
Joe, if you want to stop sharing, then maybe we could see you if that's okay.
Sure, sure.
Thanks.
Stop share. There we go.
There you go. Thank you.
Hi, Joe.
I'm back. I'm not just the voice behind a screen, right?
Right, my question is, was any of the restoration work done at Steamtown satisfactory to you and safe and will be on the completed locomotive?
So I go to the tender first when I get asked that question quite a bit, and a majority of the tender refurbishment was done at Steamtown. New sheets were replaced, the frame was straightened, truck work. So far, upon inspection, it seems to be very satisfactory. The work at Steamtown, keep in mind when I say Steamtown, it's not the National Park Service entirely. It's contractors that we had hired. They provided the space. So just want to keeping the record straight there. It's a very complex project, as I'm sure you're all getting the picture of or understand. And to have confident people doing the work and being able to manage it, it's a challenge in itself in any project. But that's one thing that we have the upper edge now, is that we have a facility to do the work on site. Working with our own volunteers, we're able to effectively use those resources. Standards changed when it was at Steamtown, so some of the running gear work, the boiler work, we feel confident that we're in a good position. Now, the firebox was a big section that was being worked on up there, and not to discredit anyone's work or talent in that regard, but looking at it as a whole was problematic to begin with, going back to the PRR days. So I hope I answered your question as clear as I could there, but it might seem like rework in some regards, but mostly if you look at take a step back and look at the larger picture, it's just simply that when the boiler or when the locomotive was built and designed, it did not meet modern standards as we need to meet today. So.
Yes, that question was in the year 2005. I worked with Bill Frederickson on the restoration of the 1361. And I wondered if anything I had done was still accepted.
Well, we can have a side conversation, or I'd welcome you to come down and show me what you did, and hopefully it's there. But well, the fire or the smoke box was replaced, and that's things that are good. One thing we did find that they had used structural rivets, and when they were replacing some rivets on it, so those have been identified. And structural rivets are at a higher tensile strength than pressure vessel rivets. So we've been very fortunate to source the rivets that we need now that are compliant, and we'll begin replacing rivets. But all things considering, it's labor, but it's not catastrophic.
Hey, Joe. At the end of the day, would you expect that the superheater and the stoker will be operational?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The superheaters have to be operational. That's a part of the original design. The stoker, I don't know about you, but I don't want to hand fire that thing as much as unless it has to be. It has the hungry appetite. But no, the stoker motor has been rebuilt, so it'll be ready to go.
Thank you. Just one last one. The front end drop coupler, I imagine that'll be operational. And
Yes.
Don't the original purpose of that was it aesthetic, or is there any operational considerations?
That's a very good question. Maybe someone else has a better answer to that, but to my knowledge, it was more aesthetics. But
my understanding was the drop coupler pilot was for safety.
was it?
When involved in automobile accidents, the coupler was at a very bad height, and would often be what actually would injure or kill people. So the ability to drop that coupler, if it wasn't in use, made it safer in an accident like that. That was my understanding. I forget where I read that, but if I see it, I'm glad to share.
Well, hey, I learned something every day, and that makes a lot of sense to me. So thank you.
Thank you.
One more question, boss. When you get this high stepper up and running, do you plan to put in positive train control or something to make it compliant with the current standards of the FRA and operate in the classrooms?
Well, I know there's some interest in that realm on it. And I know if you look at the Big Boy and some other steam locomotives across the country that are, more mainline oriented, I'm sure if we have to, I'm sure there'll be a way to overcome that. But right now, the focus is obviously getting it operational, and then if we can do, some cool sciencey tech improvements to make it compliant with the mainline requirements, I'm sure we could cross that bridge when we get to it. But I do know there's some folks that are involved in PTC with steam engines that have expressed interest in being a part of a solution if we have to cross that bridge. But I know that there are other groups that are working, dabbling in PTC.
Other questions?
While we're passing the mic around, Joe, there was one online question, and you may not be able to speak to this right now, about potential places where it would run, what short lines. You may not be able to tell us, but there was a question.
Sure. So that's probably one of the most questions we get are where's it going to run? We are very confident that it will run across the state. Those who, where I should say where it could go, the folks that are there, we have a very open dialogue with them. But we haven't made any firm commitments yet because we just certainly do not want to get the cart in front of the horse with it. And, if you read Trains Magazine, you look at the industry today, There's a lot of changing dynamics, and with not having a completion date in place of the K4 yet, it would just simply be too premature to, to announce it's going to run X, at X, Y, or Z location until we get a bit closer to reaching our fundraising goals and getting the project well near completion. But the folks who are at the short lines where it could go, we have a very good dialogue or established communication with them.
I just had a question. As part of your presentation, you mentioned at some point the 1361's brake system getting upgrades. So I was curious, was that just historically upgrades, or is it being upgraded to newer, more modern systems now? You
Right.
mentioned having the 60T brake systems, and I thought that was kind of the standard at the time it was built. So I was just curious what upgrades it either did get or is getting.
Sure. So at the time, during operation, there's more primitive style or earlier generation brake systems that the K4 had on it. But looking at, in the modern sense, we would want to put a good modern braking system on it for, I think 26L is the current standard application. And I think that if you look at 4501 at Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, I believe they put a more modern brake system in that because it was running mainline excursions or with other, people's equipment. So we definitely, when looking at the brake system, it will have a modern system on it, which is just a brake stand. It's just piping and valving. So it's not really a largely noticeable change unless you're in the cab.
Hey, Joe. Great presentation. Thank you. I had one question regarding a slide that I seen where the locomotive was in the test plant, and there seemed to be piping that was coming out of the front of the smoke box. And I was just curious. I'd love to get a picture of that slide. Just looking at it as to why they would have done that, probably for capturing some type of specific data or not. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but it looked like the piping was going right into the front of the smoke box. So
I don't know the exact answer to that because I had just found the picture when update the slides, but I want to say it has something to do with the combustion aspect. Looking at how much particle material was being admitted forward, maybe collecting the cinders and seeing how much the fuel source was being was it being fully burned, and seeing if there was any waste in that regard or seeing the efficiency.
Yeah, I didn't expect you to have that answer.
Okay, good. You put the technical PRRT&HS, right? It's all good.
They also tended to measure the temperature of the actual heat of what was coming through the tubes, as well as what was coming out through the exhaust, to try to figure out how much of that heat was actually being absorbed in the boiler and being used as opposed to just going up through the stack.
Yeah, great point.
Could have been something for them.
Don Young once again. Actually, the Pennsylvania Railroad Technical Historical Society, the Railroad and Locomotive Historical Society's recent couple issues back journal had an article on test plants. And Purdue was started in 1890, I believe, and there were several others before Pennsylvania finally decided to build one. So a lot of that data and how to collect it was established by the time Pennsylvania Railroad got there. So they were not the first. And one of the things other test plants, according to this article, collected from the front end were a range of temperatures from exhaust from the valve all the way to exhaust to the exhaust nozzle, plus a temperature profile from the exhaust gases from the tubes. And some of these test plants actually collected the total effluent from the top of the locomotive and examined it for gas analysis and solid particulate matter analysis. So there was a great range of data collected just from the front end, because drafting apparatus was always a master mechanic's sort of gut feeling as how to design these, and only test plants gave them some actual experimental knowledge to go by.
Could you repeat that publication again?
That was the Railroad and Locomotive Historical Society Journal of a couple issues back. They publish twice a year, I believe, but they had a feature article on test plants.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Joe. Guston are here. Thanks again for giving the presentation. Appreciate it. We're on a Christmas list for next year.
I think that
Just America's fascination with this climate change, and the world's going to be ending in about 3 years from now, and the war on fossil fuels and everything. What kind of challenges does this present this project with the engine being coal fired? Is it going to be like limited on where you can actually run it at, as compared to like the T1 project? They went with oil fired that engine.
Great question.
Well, that's a very good question. We were faced with that because obviously with reconstructing the firebox, whether or not to convert it to oil, and we opted to keep it coal. And there's a number of tourist lines that, as you know, our partners in crime here in Central PA at the East Broadtop, they burn coal. Reading and Northern, they burn coal. So there's a lot of Western Maryland. So there's a lot of, we feel very confident we'll be okay. But it's one of those things that, you know, if we have to adapt, we will adapt to it. But coal is very much a large part of the PRR's history and heritage. As long as we can operate it with coal, we'll keep on burning. We have to get burning first. I will say that. So with your help, we can get there.
Hey, Joe, to dovetail on that question, has the organization that does the engineering, have they done any preliminary thoughts as to how to future-proof it if that does become a problem or a challenge for you?
Yeah. So, you know, the Pennsy actually converted, I think, a couple L1s. They had some engines down at Washington Terminal that were oil burners, some switchers. So there are contingencies from a design aspect. I believe the commonplace is to use the Southern Pacific method of oil burning installation. So there's some design from the Southern Pacific Railroad that they could adapt for this application.
Hey, Joe, good presentation. How many cars would you be able to steam heat with this?
Well, the pool, or did you just say steam heat?
No. If you were running this in the wintertime, how many cars would you be able to steam heat with the steam from the engine?
I don't know for sure. I know from our perspective, we'd probably have a car with head-end power. So we probably would not be we would not do the steam heat application, but I'm not sure historically how many cars it could heat, but I know you could get lengthy trains with locomotives, and as long as you probably had good steam lines, you could probably heat a lot, probably 20 some cars.
Anybody else? Anybody else?
No. Hey, Joe, Steve Staviri.
Hi, Steve.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Good.
You know, we do have our own book here about the Altoona Test Station done by Sam Etchus years ago. And we do have copies of that, so we might try and get one over to you and take a look at and see if you want to have them for your store. But I want to thank you on behalf of the Philadelphia chapter for taking the time to do this presentation for us. We really appreciate it. It's good seeing you again.
Good to hear you. And you know, anytime. I'm glad you guys asked me to do it. You know, between the Philly chapter and the New England chapter and other chapters, you guys put some wind under our sails or behind our sails here with this project. So we want to, you know, make sure you guys are in the loop as much as you can, and we can't wait to share it all with you in May.
All right, very good, thank you.
Okay. Anything else you guys have for the good of the order?
No, Joe, we'll let you go. I want to thank everyone for attending. We had probably about 110 between here and what our max was online during the presentation. Our next Philadelphia chapter meeting is June 22nd. Some folks return or visit us live here in Brooklyn. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.